If you enjoy unusual stories, you've come to the right place.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. What is a real-life example of this? A man named Dr. Brock wrote a handbook for child rearing. It was widely circulated and well-received. Many of our parents likely got their child rearing advice from this book. In it, he recognized that babies throw up a lot and therefore recommended newborns be laid on their stomachs to sleep. Unknowingly, this would result in the accidental smothering deaths of thousands of newborns. A huge number of sudden infant death syndrome cases can be laid at his feet. To this day, the Back to Sleep campaign is still fighting to update parents on what we now know. Newborns should sleep on their backs until they can reliably roll over for themselves. My mom woke up in an absolute panic, having no idea why. She ran to check on my brother, who was a newborn at the time. He was face down, drowning in his vomit. I feel so sorry for every parent who lost their child that way because my mom would have never recovered. Haiti did not have cholera. A disastrous earthquake hit Haiti in 2010. After the earthquake, humanitarian forces from the UN arrived to help, and the Bhutanese contingent reintroduced cholera to Haiti. This epidemic has since infected approximately 850,000 people and killed over 10,000. If curses were real, Haiti would be the prime example of a cursed country. The introduction of kudzu for erosion control. It has become invasive in girdles and kills plant life above ground without establishing proper roots, therefore causing soil erosion. Leucotomy surgery to fix the mentally unwell. It sounds so good, no more reliance on medication. You're good from now on, but it didn't work. The outcomes were awful, and it was frequently done without any sort of consent. It all could have been shut down fairly quickly if people were honest about what was happening. But careers and money was at stake. So many unnecessarily suffered. Several years ago, I heard a case from the 50s or so where a young boy was lobotomized for his poor behavior. 7 years old, lobotomized for being forgetful and reading late at night. My mom called my Christian university that 17-year-old me attended by my parents' behest to inform the school that I was smoking weed, drinking, and having sex. She thought because it was a Christian university, they would put me into a counseling program to get me back on track. The school told me to pack my bags, leave immediately, and they rescinded the 80% scholarship I obtained, causing me to owe the full 100% for that semester, which I'm still paying off a decade later. Edit, this comment is getting a lot of traction, so I figured I'd add another nugget. After getting kicked out of college, my 18th birthday was the next month. My parents somehow, my dad is a tech nerd, so he could hack any account I had, found out that I was going to have a party at a friend's house to celebrate. There was alcohol and weed at the party. Lo and behold, my parents called the state police and alerted them of the party. I and 3 other friends got arrested that night. Most charges were dropped or expuned eventually. Somalian piracy. It all got started because white-collar criminals from Europe were illegally dumping toxic waste in the water near Somalian fishing waters because it was cheaper to do that than dispose of it properly. This not only killed the fish those villages needed to survive, but also resulted in miscarriages, stillbirths, and birth defects. Eventually, a bunch of the fishermen decided they'd had enough, and knowing that no one else was going to protect them, motored out to the dumping boats and took the crew hostage, demanding reparations. Thing is, they made a lot of money from that, like crazy money. Word of that started to get around, and a lot of men fighting in the militias against petty warlords decided to desert and start their own pirate crews to make bank. Suddenly, the pirates weren't just fishermen going after the criminals who were killing their children. Now they were greedy mercs going after any boats unlucky enough to enter their territory. The irony, however, comes when white-collar criminals in Europe sound familiar. Realize that by dropping a few $1,000s to set up a crew with a boat and some AK-47s, they could stand to make millions back. Sponsoring pirates was an amazing investment in terms of return. Soon, most pirate crews were picking their targets based on intel provided to them by European sponsors. If anyone wants to know more, Red River Ransom by John Cole. Amazing book. Federally backed student loans. Once money was guaranteed, colleges jacked up tuition and continued to do so with no end in sight. Most moral panics, stranger danger, convincing people in the 1970s-90s that hundreds of thousands of American children were being icked into random cars by evil strangers each year, while downplaying and underfunding the resources that could actually help decrease child abduction. Child abductions not only never came anywhere near those huge numbers, but it was and still is nearly always a custodial issue or a very close family member. Teaching people to be wary of kidnapping is great, directing all their fears toward vague, spooky strangers and not helping people learn how to actually prevent kidnapping is kind of. Gerald W. Bush admin created subsidies on corn to promote the production of ethanol to be used in fuel, etc. better for the environment and so forth. Couple of downstream effects. 1. Ethanol in fuel lowers the fuel efficiency, so you have to buy gas more frequently, more of an inconvenience, but that's why fuel with no ethanol is usually slightly more expensive. 2. Corn sold for other purposes than ethanol didn't qualify for the subsidies. so there was a strong financial incentive to sell to ethanol producers instead of for food. This drove the price of food corn and food that uses corn-derived ingredients up, affecting poor people the most. 3. The financial incentives were so strong that farmers were buying up cheap land in areas that were very unsuitable for corn production or switching away from crops that would grow more easily if they couldn't afford more land. In western North Dakota, corn needs to be heavily irrigated in order to grow. There is an enormous aquifer that stretches from Brazil to the North Dakota Panhandle. Increased irrigation combined with a years-long drought drained the aquifer to the point that the city of Hales has to truck their water in. I recall hearing that the person behind the like function of Facebook legitimately just saw it as a nice way for people to show others what they like or a way to positively react on things. It turned out that has a huge negative impact on social cognition, such as teenagers, especially girls, unfortunately developing depression, trying to rescue too many cats. This but with any kind of animal. For context, I rescue street dogs with my family in Brazil. We are able to afford to take in help with some complicated cases, treatment, dogs that need surgeries or puppies and their mom. We take those because there are a lot of rescuers that cannot afford that. Good practice is knowing exactly how you can help when and how many pups you can house at the same time. Taking them, feeding them, vaccines, groomer, treatment, neutering them, basic training, and finding them a home. However, there's several rescuers that just become hoarders. They take any dog, and many times the conditions are so bad that dogs were better off on the streets as they have crowded places filled with sick dogs, sometimes cannot afford to feed them, no medical care, and the place is a mess. Since the abysmal performance of American schools has been in the news recently, No Pupil Left Behind, and its replacement, Every Scholar Succeeds Act. America has never had really good public education, but it used to be serviceable. No Pupil Left Behind came in to try and create some milestones and accountability. Instead, it made the problem worse. Every Scholar Succeeds Act came in and tried to address its problems, but changed the stuff that wasn't the problem and left the bad parts unscathed. Taken all together, 57% of high school graduates can't read at a 7th grade reading level, and over a quarter are functionally illiterate. Oh man, this really resonates with me. My brother taught middle school history in a very low-income area in the South. This comment could be a post of its own about what's wrong with low-income area schools, but I just want to relate one thing that always baffled me. Hardly any of the kids could read. You read that right, 12 and 13-year-old kids couldn't read and could hardly spell their names. On top of that, there were behavioral problems that went completely unchecked. These kids were just allowed to do whatever they wanted. They'd repeat the mandatory grade and then they'd be passed along to be the next teacher's problem. My brother didn't teach any history those few years. Instead, his job was to teach them how to read and to stop them from fighting and selling each other pot. It sounds unbelievable, I know, but the apathy that No Pupil Left Behind caused created this giant behavioral problem and is actively setting back these low-income communities. These kids are doomed from the start and nobody cares. The people who try to help are quickly burned out due to the complete lack of support and cronyism that forms in the school system. I love this country, but our public school systems are a train wreck. Edit, a few people have added this in the replies, and I was trying to keep this comment relatively simple and neglected to add this as directly as I should have. The families were largely not in the picture. They were either in jail or didn't care. Maybe a grandparent here and there watched the kids. These kids did whatever they wanted, and when they got to school, they didn't listen to anyone. So it was in part the absence of the family, but also the school didn't do anything either. Both are the problem, the unexpected consequences of your donations. Tim's Boots, a company that pledged to donate a pair of shoes to a child in need for every pair purchased. Turns out that the company's donations disrupted local shoe markets in developing countries, putting local shoemakers out of business and creating a dependency on foreign donations. Additionally, the shoes donated by Tim's were not always appropriate for the local climate or culture and were not always of the same quality as the shoes being sold. Reportedly, they have ended up in landfills. On a similar note, donations of clothing have a similar effect, the opioid crisis. Initially, it was highly restricted and doctors hated prescribing it because they knew how addictive it could be. Well, here we are. And now the pendulum has swung hard to chronic pain sufferers being denied all pain relief because we'll become addicts. We aren't and never were the problem, but we're being forced into zero quality of life while the addicts receive tons of support. I'll poke a little at my fellow leftists here. Plastic bags. Back in the late 90s, there was a huge push for people to stop using paper grocery bags because of the amount of trees being cut down for paper. Unfortunately, it turns out the logging industry can be pretty sustainable, though not entirely faultless, and plastic bags are unrecyclable and so thin that reuse is uncommon, instead contributing to massive amounts of plastic pollution in the environment. Another example is the protest against hunting white-tailed deer. Unfortunately, we killed their natural predators, and hunting is an effective way of keeping their population at sustainable levels. The DARE program, Whoever decided DARE of all things was a good name for an anti-drug program is a massive idiot. My dad worked for a huge billboard company, and they made billboards out of large vinyl tarps. Well, anyway, one day someone has this great idea to slit up the old used billboards and donate them to a third world country to use as tents and save the environment. It sounded good till some tsunami or storm surge or something washed thousands out to sea, or maybe a flood. But what happened was the camera team zoomed in, and there was a Pepsi-Cola logo on the tarp washing right out to the ocean with loads of people. Pepsi-Cola was not happy about the negative press, and they stopped doing the program. Those parents who solve all their kids' issues and don't make them stress about consequences of their own actions. Their kids just turn into inept and entitled adults who still act 15 for decades and not only have a harder life for themselves, but make life miserable for everyone around them too. I've been watching the show Blakey with my baby boy recently, and there was an episode that got me to stop and really think. Blakey and her dad are at a park watching her younger sister and several other kids play on their own on the playground equipment. One by one, each of the kids started encountering difficulties that seemed overwhelming, but could be resolved easily if Blakey or her dad stepped in. The dad instead told Blakey to just watch and see what happens. Each kid goes through a brief moment of despair before growing determined and trying a final time, and each one finds their own form of success. The entire episode is about letting your kids to find solutions of their own. I had never been taught this. Henry Frederick Harlow, scientist, he wanted to prove that humans cannot survive without love and affection. He needed an animal that was sufficiently human-like, and he settled on Harlow's ape-men. Harlow's research went in a really dark direction. Harlow wanted to prove the importance of early social interaction in social development and the importance of family and love, but his cruel methods ended up causing some of the monkeys to engage in self-mutilation or starve themselves to death. He raised the monkeys from birth with as little love and affection in isolation chambers for up to 24 months. They became empty shells of living animals. That wasn't good intentions. Even a lot of the scientists in his field at the time said his experiments were pointless and they already had data on what he was testing. He even went on to try and continue his work. The guy was just a psycho and not much of worth came out of anything he did. Zero tolerance in schools. Now the bullied kids are being punished. I agree that zero tolerance policies are stupid. But I have to say that as a kid, it cleared up a lot of concerns for me about whether or not it would be worth it to fight back if someone started swinging at me. Once they implemented that zero tolerance, there was never a question of can I stay out of trouble by not fighting back. As soon as a punch was thrown, whoever was on the receiving end had nothing to lose. One of my classmates, after finishing a fight he didn't start, turned around and promptly did start a fight with the other guy's friend because he knew he was going to get suspended anyway and wanted to get his money's worth. Once upon a time, I found a wallet on the beach. Having lost my own more than once and not having it returned to me, I am aware that it is a stressful life event, so my first thought was how to return it quickly. Looking through the contents, the owner was from out of state and there was no contact information other than the driver's license. Aside from that, only a few credit cards and some cash. Not knowing how long ago the owner had left, I thought, let's just sit here for a while and maybe he will return looking for it since it is the first thing I would do. After a couple hours of fun and sun, we needed to move on. My next best idea was to turn it into the local police station, which we found easily enough just down the street. What I thought would be a quick in-and-out turned into a full-on interrogation session during which I was at one point accused of theft/robbery. It was a bizarre experience to say the least, which wasted an hour of our day. Bounties for killing invasive animals. You have a bunch of animals you don't want, so you pay people for each animal they kill, usually by getting them to produce the carcass or a unique body part. People then start breeding said animal as it's easier and more lucrative than catching them in the wild. The authorities find out and stop the bounty program. So the breeder let all their newly bred invasive animals into the wild. Situation is now worse than before. There's a famous example involving cobras in India. If I recall correctly, they also tried this with rabbits in the area I used to live as a kid. In this case, no breeding was required as the bounty drop-off point was the local police station. You'd go in with a bag of cute bunny tails. The officer on duty would count the tails and pay you for each tail. He'd then take the bag of tails around the back of the station and pop them in the dumpster. Which point a friend of the bounty hunter would dive into the dumpster, retrieve the tails, go into the police station by the front door and repeat the cycle with the just retrieved set of tails. The invention of social media. When Tim was working at Support Depot, I genuinely believe he wanted to build something that allowed people to socialize and communicate in a new and modern way. On paper, Early Your Page is a brilliant concept that made a lot of people realize the potential of the internet. This concept was then mutilated and turned into what social media is today. Quite possibly the single most socially damaging invention that ever happened. Far away from bringing people closer together, it has turned into a tool that is tearing people further apart, making them feel more disconnected with society than ever. And instead of democratizing discussion, it has put even more power into the hands of the elite. I smashed a window to rescue a trapped cat. House was vacant and the owner was doing maintenance and a cat got in. The police lied and said that they got the owner to let the animal out. Nobody let the poor thing out and the owner of the house stayed in the nearest city over 100 m away. The cat was trapped for 5 days before me and my partner took it upon ourselves to force entry and take the cat to the nearest vet. We handed ourselves into the police and were charged with criminal damage and breaking and entering. I was fined £800 to repair the damages and spent 3 days on a cell. I now have a criminal record and it always makes for a good story in job interviews. I told the judge that I knew I did the right thing and would do it again. Sometimes the right thing isn't the legal thing. Ouch. Maybe call an animal rescue next time, hoping there's no next time. They may be able to advise you and even help. Wasn't really an option. Live on an island off the west coast of Scotland. A lot of old programs centered around weight and eating disorders just led to kids being more conscious about being judged about their weight despite the intentions of wanting to prevent bullying or healthy weight. It did not even matter if it was anti-anorexia or wanting to decrease obesity. Also in my school, they showed us pro-anicytes with like a beware message. And I also could not help thinking that this talk was the only reason I knew they existed. Currently, the focus is more on eating healthy instead of weight. Still has some pitfalls such as orthorexia, purity culture, and the I kissed dating goodbye book movement. It was a response to hookup culture and the free love movement of the 60s and 70s and all of its downsides and dangers. But it left people with no idea how to have healthy relationships, sexual dysfunction and worse, not to mention a net increase in STI and teen pregnancy as they never learned how to protect themselves and mitigate risks. I grew up in the church and read this book. I remember young people would rush and marry the first person who would have them because they wanted to be able to have sex but didn't want to go to hell. Then they end up divorced 2 years later because they married the wrong person. And since most people won't be in a relationship with you if you won't have sex with them, it led to a tiny limited dating pool of just people from your church. So it would be a ton of women fighting over a few men. We'd go years without a single date, praying God would send us a godly man who would be willing to wait. Thomas Milo, a great scientist, he helped to get rid of the problem of petrol causing knocking in engines by adding lead to gasoline. Then he turned his devourers to reducing the amount of toxic and flammable gases used in aircon and refrigeration systems, and invented chlorofluorocarbons. I would argue he had no good intention to begin with, nor was he a good scientist because he ignored experiential data. He repeatedly got acute lead poisoning that didn't agree with his thesis he could have chosen. Ethanol, instead, he and Keterin chose profit on a personal scale trying to help a really drunk person. I'm a woman and talkative, and I started talking to another woman at a bar who was really, really drunk. She told me her friends deserted her, so I said she could hang out with me and my friends as it was my birthday to keep an eye on her and because she seemed fun. Then she started falling off of chairs and spilling drinks, so I encouraged her to get a cab. She started crying how everyone hates her as I was helping her outside but agreed to go home. I got a cab, paid for it because she was a mess. And all of a sudden she got really violent and ended up kicking me in the face trying to get out of the cab because she wasn't done. She pushed me and told me to off but ultimately sat back down in the cab crying. We had already exchanged numbers. So the next day she texted me apologizing profusely and asking if we could stay friends. I told her I appreciated her apology but no thanks. I will always try to help people where I can, but that turned me off from going above and beyond. Plus, you can rarely rationalize with really drunk and upset people. Microtransactions in video games started out great. Extra level or 2 here, some new weapons armor there. Now at $20, cosmetics and gambling boxes where you have a small chance of getting the cool thing, and entire games built exploiting these systems for profit. Marxism. I love how it's been 5 minutes and we already have a comment saying capitalism and a comment saying Marxism. During one of China's extreme dry seasons, think of their Dust Bowl period. Mao ordered the killing of birds to prevent bird-eating seeds and so increase agricultural productivity. Instead, what happened is that birds that fed on plants' pests were killed, making the situation even worse and resulting on the death of millions. A bad dry season, deforestation, misuse of pesticides, and a war against nature under his belief that conquering nature was the way to improve agricultural yield and so the well-being of their citizens. Stupid, uninformed decisions, even if seemingly rational to a layman, resulting in one of the biggest human and ecological cost disasters. We're still making such decisions from time to time, sometimes for profit on the belief that such will benefit all and sometimes for genuine good reasons. I feel like most of China's cultural revolution was implemented with good intentions but yielded devastating results. They were so desperate to get out of extreme poverty and wanted to modernize fast. Unfortunately, the people who spearheaded this movement were so uneducated and prideful that they made one shitty decision after another, which leads to their deaths, followed by drones of brainwashed people who carried out their orders. It makes me sad to think about all the human suffering and death this caused. My mom remembers what it was like when she had to visit the mainland from Hong Kong as a child. Whenever she visited, she and her siblings had to haul an enormous amount of things, food, cooking oil, clothing, etc., from Hong Kong to give to her relatives in the mainland because they didn't have any. They couldn't buy any because there wasn't any available. She remembered vividly the time when she ate an apple to its core. Then her mainland cousin grabbed it from her and ate the core so it wouldn't be wasted.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.